So I'm going to continue with this idea of artists saving the world. But this actually will be a bit of an academic talk because I wear different hats. So I'm going to wear the hat first of all as an academic and then as an artist, or maybe vice versa. So I want to propose a simple question to you, which is the following. What kind of self are we in the process of becoming in a world in which autonomous processes actually create new understandings of us as selves? And then the second question is, what role do the arts, but not only the arts, but the relationship between the arts, the social sciences, and the humanities play in responding to this issue? And I want to start off with this image here about the discipline of behavioral biometrics. So behavioral biometrics, if you don't know, is a technique that basically monitors your actions and to create databases of those actions. And there's a recent quote in Forbes magazine, the American Business Journal, which stated, "In the world of behavioral biometrics, machine learning, deep learning, and artificial intelligence are all going together hand in glove." Now, as most of you know, biometrics, of course, is the capture of your biological signs. Your fingerprint, your iris, in an airport, your face. But these are all static characteristics of humans. So behavioral biometrics goes to the next step. The next step is basically to capture dynamic things. So for instance, one company called BioCatch claims it can capture up to 2,000 parameters from your use of a cell phone. So for instance, you're toggling between fields, the way you turn the phone in terms of its acceleration, basically your hand gestures, the pressure when you type, and of course, the amount of information and way you interact on certain types of online applications. Now, what this essentially accounts for is essentially building up a database of continuous actions. That is, your human gestures can actually be tagged and tied to your devices. Now, the idea with such a technology is to create kind of an individual gestural portrait of each person, but there's a problem with that. The problem is that people are actually not machines. They work in unpredictable ways. As Forbes says, there's no magical or fixed set of behavioral parameters that are used consistently to tell people apart. So we have this interesting problem. Now, the last sentence is really critical because what basically this technology tries to do is find an optimization of your actions, okay? The optimal set for an optimized user, right? So tagging your optimal set of gestures and behaviors to your device. Now, of course, as some of you know, this is one of the desires of statistical learning, or also known as machine learning, which utilizes these statistical processes. So, for instance, trying to fit a line to data in regression, or a correlation, or dimensionality reduction, or clustering, to try to knock out the outliers and to find a predictable path and profile of a kind of set of behaviors. Now, this sounds really radical. But actually, it's a pretty old idea. It's based on a model pioneered by economics in the 19th century called Homo economicus, literally economic man. Now, what is economic man? Well, economic man is the assumption that human beings are rational creatures and seek optima. We seek to optimize our behavior, and in economics, our preferences, what we choose, one thing or another, our utility, so to speak. So most of these models of optimized human behavior are based actually on a much larger ideological assumption. And that is the following. That is the idea that by quantifying our behavior and our experience, we can create more accurate understandings of ourselves. Okay? Now, this, of course, sounds shockingly anti-humanist. But in fact, if you look back in history in the 19th century, economics, physiology, psychology were disciplines that emerged to actually investigate and explore this point. They actually believed that it was an enlightened approach to create these quantified portraits of humans. This is an interesting image. It's from the Cambridge expedition of 1898. This was actually one of the first anthropological expeditions that took those disciplines, economics, physiology, psychology, and brought an entire crew of anthropologists scientists, psychologists to the Torres Straits, which are between Queensland and New Guinea, to essentially measure the senses of the natives there, okay? So they wanted to test reaction time. They wanted to test physiological data. This is an image of testing color. So they basically wanted to create these sensory profiles in order to classify these natives statistically. Now, this seems preposterous. And of course, in post-colonial context now, it's almost racist. But in fact, it's pretty standard. Ian Hacking, who's a Canadian anthropologist or historian of science, has a term for this. He calls it making up people. Now, this is a very interesting idea. Hacking basically said, with the invention of statistics in the the end of the 18th century, early 19th century, that essentially tools were developed to classify people. So he says basically there were techniques like counting, quantifying, correlating, medicalizing, biologizing human beings. And what these tools did was, so, quote, create new kinds of people that hadn't actually existed before, okay? So this is this weird idea that by creating some kind of categories, you actually invent something new. Now, this idea of making up people today goes by the term pretty much data science, right? Machine learning, predictive analytics are integral to something like behavioral biometrics because these rely on statistical procedures to pick out these patterns in these massive sets of data and to cluster and analyze and essentially classify them, right? So this is about classifying human beings. So in many ways, even though we think we're in the AI revolution, a lot of these ideas actually date back to the 19th century. Now, all of the current interest in AI, for instance, in these applications like behavioral biometrics, has to do a lot with securitization, right? Protecting your data, protecting you from fraud, from Russian hackers who might break into your cell phone and these kinds of things. But I want to actually question the my or our about what this data is, because if I say my data, that assumes I have a stable self in which that data belongs to, okay? Now, if you look, however, at these new technologies, if you look at these kind of statistical procedures, we actually find the total opposite. We actually find that more and more, there is no notion of a body, there is no notion of a subject, and there is no notion of a self in these systems, okay? In fact, to view ourselves as a statistical measure suggests that we can actually be perceived less as a human being and more like a bundle of properties that's constituted at specific points in time and therefore changes, right? So it destabilizes some understanding of a stable notion of a self. Here's an interesting quote on Fitbit site from Fitspiration: "Don't compare yourself to others, compare yourself to yesterday." Right? So we don't want to compare ourselves to other people. We want to think about comparing ourselves to ourselves. Now, what's interesting is in the context of this whole festival, and in terms of the notion of error, is that more recently they've done lots of studies on a lot of these fitness trackers, and as Fitbit as well, and discovered that about 60% of the data produced by them is false, is subjected to error. So this is very interesting. If we believe in statistics, like many people do, we believe actually in the fact that we're constructed of these errors. But if we can be numericized and optimized, as the case goes, then something actually more profound might be happening, which is rarely talked about, but I think it's interesting to think of, which is that we actually might start to conceive ourselves as anew, right? As entrepreneurial kinds of selves. Now, economists have a name for this, and probably many of you know it. They call it human capital, okay? So human capital is this idea made popular by the Nobel Prize-winning economist Gary Becker in the 1960s, actually, that we invest in ourselves in order to influence our potential earning in the future. So this includes where we go to school, picking the right university, learning new skills, or even, having new implants to basically make ourselves more attractive. So these are all the ways we invest in ourselves. Now, human capital is also, of course, a cornerstone of an ideology, or let's say a political ideology that I don't need to say much about because we're in Europe, and of course it's neoliberalism. And neoliberalism, one very good definition from the economist Philip Moravsky is that neoliberalism constitutes the dismantling of the distinction between markets and the rest of social life and experience. So if basically we can dismantle this distinction, all things can be treated, of course, as markets, from breathing to making art to dying. Now, it's interesting because Moravsky has this very interesting quote where he says, if you don't like the way things are looking, if you don't like this, has the state of the world got you down? Well, then you can create your own personal solipsistic economy, a fit virtual abode for your own fragmented entrepreneurial identity. That's the ultimate in self-reliance, which of course one of the ideologies of neoliberalism is that we become self-reliant. We shouldn't rely on other entities like the state or something like that. Okay, so that's the very kind of academic side of the talk. Now, in the last 4 minutes, we can ask the question, okay, now what will artists do? I think it's presumptuous, as now I'm speaking as an artist, to assume that artists are going to save the world, especially when we're in the context of kind of megalithic corporate institutions like Google and Facebook, which immediately want to co-opt anything that actually adds to critique within the machinery of late techno-scientific capitalism. So I guess I would just give a couple of things that I think how artists might respond to these questions. So the first is how to work with others, right? Now, for instance, there's a whole discipline called the Social Studies of Science and Technology, Science, Technology, and Society, STS, which has done years and years of work on the context of standardization, measurement, and quantification in cultural practices and in scientific practices. Now, artists are really, really good at challenging these notions of quantification, right? That not everything can be reduced to numbers because things operate in fantasy, in the imagination, in people's bodies that are not easily reduced. But I think that in terms of, the larger panel discussion is that we need more collaborations between artists and these experts in these humanities and social sciences field, like anthropologists, sociologists, who actually have done a lot of work on this because we don't have to reinvent the wheel. The second idea is this notion of revealing, and it's the need to bring these hidden systems basically into the public's eye. And of course, artists are very good at doing that. There's a term in the sociology of science called the public engagement with science. Now, this is this kind of idea that artists work with scientists to create these kinds of illustrations of scientific ideas to communicate science to the public. But I would push it further. That's very demonstrative and illustrative. For instance, like I was just talking earlier today with my collaborator Takashi Ikegami, and we were talking about how could you create, using machine learning or artificial life, a different sense of lived time for people that instead, at the same time, the machine itself has to develop its own sense of time. So this sense of time, this sense of changing your experience, looking or feeling something in terms of your attention becomes really interesting because artists are very, very good at understanding the relationship between perception and attention. And the last thing I'll say is the question of the political implications of cultural practices. And so I live in Montreal. In fact, down the street from me, Microsoft is building one of the second largest AI research labs in North America. And there's a huge debate in Montreal, which of course is one of the centers for deep learning research on ethics. And while philosophers and ethicists, and I think this relates very much to what Derek was saying, philosophers and ethicists can really have these debates about ethics in discourse, artists actually can materialize these debates in material circumstances. So it's a kind of thinking about like enacting an ethical quandary or a kind of ethics for the future in the present now. You don't just talk about it, you actually enact it. And this, I think, is another way that basically culturally we can stem the tide of the kind of ever encroaching apocalypse of quantifying and optimizing ourselves. Thank you.